Last time, when we talked about the history of ancient Egypt, we were giving you the 30,000-foot view of the history of Egypt from the early dynastic period up until the Second Intermediate Period. Today, we talk about the New Kingdom through to the Roman period on this episode. Today, we are discussing the history of ancient Egypt from a very, very high-level view. If you like these videos and wish to help out, please hit that subscribe button. It really matters to us. And if you want to help us financially, please consider becoming a Patreon member or perhaps buying my book, The Ark of the Covenant in its Egyptian Context, an Illustrated Journey. Last time, we covered the history of ancient Egypt, the early dynastic period, the Old Kingdom, the First Intermediate Period, the Middle Kingdom, and then the Second Intermediate Period. What we're going to start with today is the New Kingdom. Last time, we ended off with the Second Intermediate Period with the Hyksos enriching themselves at the expense of the Egyptians. Well, it didn't take long for the Egyptians not to really appreciate this. The Hyksos really squeezed the Thebans for as much tax as they could get. And at some point, enough was enough. And the Thebans decided to throw off the shackles. So they decided to go to war against the Hyksos. At first, it was the last kings of Dynasty 17 in the Second Intermediate Period that started the conflict. The Theban king, Second Enrei-Tau, started a series of wars against the Hyksos. But he was killed on the battlefield. Really what happened was he was injured on the battlefield, captured, and then executed by the Hyksos, and then left for dead. Basically, they left his body to rot on the field several days. Second Enrei-Tau's brother, King Ahmose I, continued the crusade against the Hyksos, and eventually drove the Hyksos from the city of Avaris, leaving the unfortunate citizens there to become enslaved. And we have that enslavement of the people of Avaris recorded by Ahmose's general, who also happens to be named Ahmose, but Ahmose, son of Abana. Now, Ahmose is an incredibly common name at the end of the 17th, beginning of the 18th dynasties. And frankly, men and women could be called Ahmose. It was that popular of a name. So here we have this general, Ahmose, son of Abana, who records the conquest of Avaris and the taking of slaves there. So we know exactly when Avaris was enslaved as a city. This begins the New Kingdom and the 18th dynasty. Now, the New Kingdom consists of three dynasties: Dynasty 18, Dynasty 19, and Dynasty 20. Dynasty 18 is in many ways seen as sort of the height of the Egyptian Empire, the height of Egyptian culture. It was the time of the New Kingdom temples. It was the time when kings started to not just expand their borders, but leave garrisons there as well, and administrative centers. Early on in the 18th dynasty, we have a ruler, the first, more or less, queen of the 18th dynasty, Queen Hatshepsut. Now, Hatshepsut was actually the wife of Thutmose II. And what happened was, her husband dies, and the heir to the throne is an infant, Thutmose III. So she steps in as regent. But after a few years, she likes being in charge so much, she decides to wear the funny hats herself and declares herself king. And she rules as pharaoh for 21 years. At that point, when she finally passes on, her stepson, who's the rightful ruler to the throne, decides he can't really trust the royal courtiers. He doesn't like court life, so he's going to go to war. He's going to go on campaign as long as he can. So Thutmose III decides that he prefers life on the battlefield, life in basically a military tent, and going on campaign from place to place, rather than ruling at home. So he does these campaigns into Kush, into Libya, and most importantly, into the Levant, where he extends the borders of Egypt all the way up to Syria. This creates an empire that lasts for 300 years. And basically brings Egypt to its absolute height as an empire, as a military power. Another interesting king of Dynasty 18 is King Akhenaten, best known for Atenism, the monolatrous worship of the sun disk, the Aten. Now, unlike what's assumed by many people, Atenism wasn't actually a monotheism. It was actually a pantheism. But what happens is, Akhenaten moves the Dynasty 18 capital from Thebes to Amarna. And he changes the whole sort of structure of religious life in Egypt. He defunds the temples. He makes the official religion this solar deity. And he's not the only ruler to rule at Amarna. After him, we have Semenkhare and then King Tut, who reigns there 3 years, and then moves everything back to Thebes, where he restores the traditional religion of ancient Egypt. But when King Tut dies, he leaves a problem, because King Tut had no heirs. He was the last Theban prince. Without a successor to the throne, we now had a dynastic crisis, a succession crisis. This begins a turn of events where his widow, Ankhsenamun, decides to send a letter to the Hittites to ask to send a prince to rule as king over Egypt. Well, the courtiers weren't going to have anything of this. So the Vizier Ai and General Horemheb conspire to knock off this Hittite prince en route. So General Horemheb goes off, kills the prince, and while he's away from home, the Vizier Ai takes the throne. A little bit of palace intrigue going on here. While the competition's out there, sneak in, just slip in and take the throne. Well, Ai rules for 4 years. He's already an old man. His son somehow doesn't take the throne. We don't know if he was assassinated or what, but Ai's only son doesn't manage to take the throne. So the throne goes to General Horemheb. General Horemheb also doesn't have any children. Now, this is actually the 4th king in the row now that doesn't have any children, because Tut's predecessor, Semenkhare, also didn't have any children. Tut was a brother. as far as we can tell. So 4 kings in a row without an heir, that's a succession crisis. So General Horemheb, being a pragmatist, says to himself, okay, this can't go on. So he takes his good friend, General Ramses, and makes him his crown prince. Well, at the time when Ramses is made crown prince, Ramses is already a grandfather. An instant dynasty. Brilliant solution to the problem. So when Horemheb passes on, General Ramses becomes Ramses I, lives a few years, then his son Seti I takes the throne, and then his grandson Ramses II takes the throne. Now, now we're into Dynasty 19. The Ramessides form the 19th dynasty. But the Ramessides have an uneasy relationship with the Theban priests. They're not Theban princes. And the Theban priesthood is not going to let them forget that. So their power base isn't in Thebes. So Ramses II moves the capital from Thebes to Paramses, where his power center is. The Ramessides, General Ramses, Seti I, Ramses II, they're all from the area of Paramses, that area around Avaris. And they received that land and through their ancestors, through the conquest done by King Akhmosa in Dynasty 18. So now we have the capital in the delta, only 2 kilometers now from the city of Avaris. And the capital will remain at Paramses through Dynasty 19 and Dynasty 20. And that marks Dynasty 20. We have the very last king of Dynasty 20, Ramses XI, who, like Mentuhotep IV that we talked about in the last video, also becomes incapacitated. When he becomes incapacitated, a new renaissance, that Wekamesu, is now declared. And instead of the vizier taking over, we now have the responsibilities for the king divided. His successor, Semendes, will sort of control the area in the delta. But the Theban priesthood wants its piece of the pie. So they become sort of semi-autonomous in Thebes. This marks this division of power marks a new period in Egyptian history, the Third Intermediate Period. And the capital once again moves, because the river moves. So Paramses no longer becomes viable as a city, and Dynasty 21 has to set up shop in a new place. And they pick the city of Tanis to set up a new city. Now, Tanis hadn't been a city before. It had been more of a field, an area. But they take a lot of the bricks, a lot of the blocks from Paramses, and recycle them to build Tanis. So a lot of the blocks at Tanis have the markings of Ramses II, even though it wasn't a city at the time, because they had recycled all those blocks. Now, Tanis is ruled by Dynasty 21 and Dynasty 22, and it's important because we also find at Tanis the burial of several Egyptian kings. King Susanes I, Shoshenq II, and it's probably one of the largest concentrations of royal burials we find. But it doesn't last all that long. We already see in Dynasty 22 that you have this government in Tanis, but another competing dynasty, Dynasty 23, starts to be built at the same time. This sort of division of powers shows that the kingdom is becoming weak. And what happens is a very powerful Kushite empire takes over. Dynasty 25. The Napatan or Nubian dynasty. These are kings from southern Kush in Sudan. And they conquer all of Egypt, all the way up into the Levant. And they're very, very successful. Kings like King Pi, King Taharka. And what's interesting about the Nubian dynasty, the Dynasty 25, is that it sort of doubled downs on Egyptian symbolism. Their sort of criticism of the Egyptians was, well, the Egyptian dynasties failed because they failed to be Egyptian enough. So they would put 2 uraeus on their crowns instead of just 1. Double the uraeus for double the power. They built for themselves pyramids back in Nubia. They build more pyramids than the Egyptians do. In fact, we find more pyramids in Nubia than any other place in the world. So they're terrific pyramid builders. They don't build big pyramids. They're really small pyramids. Some are only a few meters tall. But they love the symbolism of the pyramid. And they are just really attached to Egyptian symbolism. While the Nubian dynasty was very, very successful, nothing lasts forever. And eventually what happens is Assyria invades. Syria is a ruthless imperial power, and it works on a doctrine of fear. They come in, they break some skulls, and then that fear is supposed to be incentive for you to continue paying them tribute. Well, Assyria comes in 663 BC, destroys some temples, takes all the gold furniture from the temples and melts it all down for gold, and drives the Nubian 25th dynasty out of Egypt. And the Nubian dynasty is forced to return back to its homeland in the kingdom of Kush. Now, the Nubian dynasty continues on and continues building pyramids and stuff, but it'll never become the great imperial power it once was. So, the Assyrians put in their own puppet regime, the 26th dynasty. And the most famous king of this period is Necho II. Now, what happens is, soon after installing the 26th dynasty, the Assyrians start to run into trouble at home. Their policy of terror starts to breed resentment. And a coalition of Babylonian and Medes decide to get some payback and go to war against Assyria. Now, Assyria knows it's in trouble. So it calls on the dynasty it just helped rise to power for assistance. And they say, okay, you owe us. And Necho II goes, yeah, okay, I do owe you. So he takes his army and he marches through Palestine. And it's during this march that he encounters the Judahite king, King Josiah, who says, no, I don't want you to go help the Assyrians. No, that ain't happening. And Necho goes, don't interfere here. This is God's business. Don't interfere. Josiah doesn't listen and he's killed. Necho manages to reach his allies up in Carchemish, joins with the Assyrians, and they lose. The Assyrians lose to the Babylonians. The Assyrian Empire is completely destroyed, and Necho and his army manages to flee back to Egypt. But the 26th dynasty is unable to prevent anything else from incurring into its borders. Eventually, Nebuchadnezzar invades Egypt, wreaking lots of havoc and damage, but doesn't dethrone the 26th dynasty. But the dynasty is unable to stop Nebuchadnezzar either. So they become sort of a paper tiger at this point, unable to fight. And the 26th dynasty manages to last until Babylon herself is conquered by the Persians. The Persians ultimately destroy Babylon and manage to conquer the entire ancient Near East. Everything except the Greeks. So they sweep all across the ancient Near East and down into Egypt. And they set up their own dynasty in Egypt, the 27th dynasty. And while the Persians are down there, they start creating atrocities pretty much immediately. After a while, the Egyptians managed to throw the Persians off and establish an independent kingdom for about 3 dynasties. These are 3 very short dynasties. The independent kingdom doesn't last very long. And then the Persians are back. And they're determined to really make an impact. So they double down on the atrocities. They go from bad to worse, which is quite remarkable for the Persians. Now, the Persians have their own enemies, and those enemies are the Greeks. And in 332, Alexander the Great invades Egypt and throws off the Persians. And the Egyptians see the Greeks as liberators. After the years of atrocities under the Persians, they welcomed the Greeks with open arms. The Greeks set up their capital at Alexandria and then leave for a short period of time. In 323 BC, Alexander the Great dies, leaving it up in the air who was going to take over this vast Greek empire, this new Hellenistic empire. Well, there's some controversy over who takes over, but eventually the 4 generals of Alexander decide to divide his empire into 4 kingdoms. And one of those kingdoms is Egypt, taken over by General Ptolemy, who in 305 BC became Ptolemy I and set up the Ptolemaic dynasty of Egypt. That dynasty lasts 300 years, until towards the end of the Ptolemaic period, infighting between the heirs to the throne led to Egypt's demise. You had Ptolemy the 13th, Ptolemy the 14th, and Cleopatra the 7th. Yes, that Cleopatra, all fighting for the throne. And Cleopatra the 7th is just a little better at politics. She enlists the help of Julius Caesar, who sails down the Nile, destroying the Library of Alexandria, and dispatching her other brothers. So Julius Caesar secures the throne for Cleopatra. However, Cleopatra is very perfidious. And when Julius Caesar is assassinated, she lends aid and comfort to Mark Antony, one of the conspirators. Well, Mark Antony flees to Egypt where he has Cleopatra's support and the support of the Egyptian army. Mark Antony loses the battle to Augustus Caesar. Cleopatra commits suicide because the Romans are coming. And her son, Ptolemy XV, becomes king of Egypt for 11 days. When Augustus Caesar arrives in Alexandria, he puts Ptolemy XV to death, and Egypt now becomes a Roman province, which it remains until the invasion of Islam in 641 AD. Well, that covers our whirlwind tour of the history of Egypt. We started with the pre-dynastic period. We then do the early dynastic period of dynasties 1 and 2. Then we cover the Old Kingdom, the first intermediate period with the Civil War, the Middle Kingdom with the great pharaohs of Dynasty 12, the second intermediate period with the Hyksos, the New Kingdom with the great golden pharaohs of Thutmose III, Tutankhamen, Ramses II, the third intermediate period with Tanis and the Nubian dynasties, the late period with the Persians and the Sayites and the independent kingdom, then the Ptolemies and that Greek Hellenistic kingdom, followed finally by Rome itself, the Roman province of Egypt. So that covers the history of ancient Egypt. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you very much for watching, and see you next time on Ancient Egypt and the Bible.